Welcome to the Academy of Esports podcast. I'm your host, James O'Hagan. This is a great episode today. I've been trying to get this man on for 2 years, and we're buddies. We're friends. We talk. What about once a week, probably?
For sure, on average.
At least. Yeah. This is my friend Ken Shelton. Ken, thank you so much for being on the Academy of Esports podcast.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. I'll say we've talked about it for 2 years, but I have not turned you down for 2 years.
No, you have not. It's always just been a matter of making our schedules work, sorting things out. But Ken, I want to give some people an opportunity for people to kind of get to know you a little better. There may be some educators who don't know who you are. There may be some people who are wondering, Ken's not an esports person. Why are you having him on the podcast?
Right.
My introduction to Ken was probably, I don't know how many years ago it was, but Ken speaks on an international level on topics specifically on education, but I think is most eloquent when he is talking about and presenting topics on equity and equality, the differences there are, and why it is so important in education. And in the last week, we talked to Erin Ashley Andrews, and she, the NCAA made some changes, and she spoke very deeply about inclusion issues, especially at historically black colleges and universities when it comes to the NCAA and where esports kind of fits into all that. But Ken, what is a little bit, just as much as we can, because I know you love to talk, can you give us just, how did you end up from teaching in the classroom in Los Angeles to being an internationally recognized speaker? You just launched some new material on your website. How did you get here?
So basically, my short version of my story is I really didn't have any desires to work in education early in my adulthood. I do come from a family of educators. My father was, by the time he reached the latter portions of his career, he was an assistant superintendent and the chief business officer for 3 different county offices of education here in California. And, and so ultimately when my early attempts at trying to play professional football didn't pan out, then I would say a few peaks and a lot of valleys as far as acting goes. And I would say I did have reasonable to high degrees of success doing modeling work and print work. When that was not consistent, my dad basically said, you need to look at increasing the options. I'm not telling you not to pursue things, but you should need to increase the options. So ultimately, the short version is I started substitute teaching, and I realized that I had always had or envisioned myself at some point, especially after my freshman year of playing football at UCLA, I had envisioned that I would go back and teach in high school and be a high school football coach. So, so I started, substitute teaching and kind of got into that and got into it more and more and more. And it still gave me the flexibility to do print work. And I was also in a theater group for several years. So ultimately, I went all in with that, got my credential, got a second credential, then ended up getting a third certification, which is why I'm such a staunch advocate for the CTE world as well, which my third certification is in career and technical education. And then I ended up pursuing a master's degree. I'm still on the cusp of pursuing a doctorate at this moment. But ultimately, by doing that, for me, it was a byproduct of, I would argue, why I was successful in sports is I never accepted the status quo. I never embodied a mindset of complacency. And, so it just, I would say the big push was my dad back in 2007 went to a big meeting at the Googleplex in Mountain View and then called me afterwards and said, I just went to the Google offices for something that they're going to be doing for education. You need to have this on your radar because I know you're into technology and I know you do all the tech stuff. You need to have this on your radar because they're going to launch a program that I think you should pursue. And that ended up being the Google Teacher Academy. So, my dad's advice was on point then. Then go to a couple of years later, I was fortunate enough to become an Apple Distinguished Educator. But the reason why I mention those is because ultimately I recognize that one of the values or one of the things I really like about education in general is our default willingness to share.
Mm-hmm.
And in both of those areas, and then in general, I noticed a what I would say a collegial camaraderie that I needed more of. And then I realized very quickly after getting my first speaking opportunity in front of probably about 50 people for a workshop is I can combine my passion in education, my desires to be on stage, which is, like I said, I was in a theater group,
Mm-hmm.
and um, I would say the adrenaline or rush that I get being in front of a big crowd, which I got from football. So you combine all of those, and this is where I was like, okay, then if I'm going to do it, I'm going all in. And my whole thing has always been, if you're going to be a Bear, you might as well be a Grizzly, so or a Bruin. Uh,
No.
so,
Anything but a
so
Trojan.
yeah, yeah, exactly. But at any rate, so then I really started doing. I accelerated my reading. I started doing more studying of practice in regards to public speaking. Like I said, my theater background helped a whole lot as far as being able to be projected with your voice, being able to use things like stage real estate, being able to weave in what I would say key points among narratives.
Mm-hmm.
And then you combine that with the design aspect that was part of my master's degree, as well as my understanding of design. And then I also taught it. It just accelerated where I've been fortunate enough to get a lot of stages. I still want more stages, but I will say in the last probably 3 to 4 years, my narratives have shifted because early on it was around why you should have technology, why we should use technology. When I want to say, actually, it's not even 4 years ago. It's probably closer to about, honestly, probably 6 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
conversation with a former student of mine where I realized that technology is great and we do need it. But one, not everyone has it. Two, not
Mm-hmm.
everyone even has access in the first place. And three, it's not the panacea.
Mm-hmm.
So it is it should be a definitive and required component to any child's educational experience, K through 12, and really even higher ed. But I just say K through 12 because, ultimately you mentioned equity. Some children are not going to go to college and they shouldn't be forced to, nor should they have to. By the time they turn 18, you should have options. And so, so for me, it just, my whole narratives have shifted to more along the lines of, equity and inclusion, diversity, which I know we'll talk about a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
and then adding layers of anti-bias and anti-racist training support, ongoing learning, and analyses of the curriculum that we teach, because there's a lot of that is embedded in the curriculum that I think perpetuates some of the inequities that exist and some of the false narratives that educators tend to gravitate towards, because those false narratives essentially are a way of abdicating to their complacency and comfort rather than pushing their thinking so that they can do better.
So, and I think what we're seeing right now, and again, we'll talk, I want to touch on the differences between equity and equality, because I think that those are two terms that get misused and some people think they're interchangeable. But what I feel that, and you can probably speak to this, is, we go to a lot of conferences, technology conferences, and we see tools presented by people who have never stepped foot in a classroom, who have no background, no education, who fill a room. We can't figure out why. But what we're seeing right now is that all that stuff, all that time people spent in a room learning about Google Apps for Education or Adobe or God knows whatever tool it is, the warts have been laid bare in our country as to just how important equity of access, or I guess we'll talk about equity or equality, but access in our country, the inequities of access in our country are rearing their ugly heads. It doesn't matter how many tools you have. It doesn't matter what that knowledge was. You missed out on these opportunities to really begin to get down and understand just how important just a simple issue of access is now a social justice issue, because we have kids who don't have internet access at home. We have kids who maybe are only sharing one computer and there's 3 or 4 kids in the house, and now they're being asked to do their school learning without any supports from teachers or from their school district. Families are having to purchase internet access, or they have inadequate access. And here's the other thing I'm starting to figure out too. There are some teachers who don't even have some of these tools in their homes. They can't afford internet access. And yet we're asking teachers now, though it's not in a contract, though it's not explicitly ever said, hey, you have to teach online. Some of these teachers never signed up for this. So,
So you just brought up several things. One, and I did a blog posting on it,
Mm-hmm.
is that no matter how you package it, e-learning, remote learning, distance learning, is not working, and it never had a chance in the first place. So let me paint a picture for you and for your listeners on this. So my master's degree is in it's the official title is New Media Design and Production, and so it's essentially design and instructional technology or educational technology. So I had courses on like computer-based instruction, design for synchronous and asynchronous instruction, design for inclusivity, looking at incorporating a variety of methodologies within the context of designing for, whether it's designing for learning, designing for specific outcomes, designing for ongoing training. I mean, all of those things. I had to take classes on distance learning, e-learning, and
Mm-hmm.
remote learning. They're not all the same.
No.
So for example, e-learning requires technology. Distance and remote learning do not require technology. I know I'm noticing that some teachers are having trouble being able to discern what exactly synchronous and asynchronous mean. And it's of no fault of their own. But the reason why I'm saying that is I had to take a full year of classes on those topics in my master's program.
Mm-hmm.
So to expect teachers, schools, school leaders, and school districts to automatically say, okay, we're shutting down schools, so we're just going to do remote or distance learning.
Mm-hmm.
It was, like I said, it was never going to be successful right from the start. And I don't want any of your listeners to take this as an indictment on teachers or school leaders, because ultimately I think there's degrees of culpability, but it was never going to work, because here's the thing, and you just pointed to it. There's the US DOE released a report, I want to say last year or the year before, 1 in 5 children don't have internet access in the home.
Mm-hmm. And
so,
well, I want to pause on that for a second, because you're talking about 20% of your kids in a class of 20 children. You're talking about 4 who don't have access at home. And I can tell you too, from my personal experience, and to bring this around to esports, because in my community of Racine, Wisconsin, where we have a high poverty rate, where issues of access abound, where we suspect actually 30% in our community don't have access to the internet. I know how important esports is. I know how important play is. The connections that these kids have made with adults, the connections that they've made with each other through play, through esports, competitive gaming. And what I've seen is an entire team, one high school team, because of demographics or whatever, has disappeared. It's like, and here's what troubles me about that is, again, and this goes to the bigger topic as well. Imagine if somebody said to me, well, baseball's not going on and football may not go on in the fall. I said, yeah, but imagine this. What if 3/4 of your baseball team is still playing baseball, but the other 25% can't?
right.
For whatever reason? You would never let that happen. You would never let that happen, ever.
No. And, look, it's why I keep pushing educators now. And again, I actually have a link in my blog posting, encouraging educators to sign a petition. The fact that the internet isn't a utility is absurd.
Absolutely.
You can't tell me now. Now people are seeing that, like, yeah, it's just as important as the lights, the gas, the electricity. I mean, whatever it is that are required for you to live your daily life, the internet is part of that.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's running a business from home, connecting to a school, connecting to information, banking. I mean, I think about how many things people are doing now that if they don't have internet access, they can't do it, period. And so then now you're adding the layer of that to schools and to kids. And to your point, look, again, I think that a lot of school leaders have done a good job of managing what I would call our current pandemic and time frame as educational triage, because they're doing the best they can under the circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
But my whole thing is also, okay, so you did this now, great. what's going to happen in the fall, and what are we going to look at a year from now? So, for example, in the school districts where they handed out hotspots to all the kids, in the fall, when school resumes, which it will not be the same, and I hope it isn't the same as what it was,
Mm-hmm.
and we can touch on that a little bit. Are you going to take the hotspots back? Or are you going to make sure that the kids have them? And even with the hotspots, it's literally a Band-Aid on the symptom of the disease. And it's, the hotspots have bandwidth limitations. They may have data limitations.
Mm-hmm.
What happens just to your point, what happens if you're in a household, let's say you're in a household where you have, more than one child and they all do have a device. Are they using one hotspot? Can it handle those connections? I saw grossly irresponsible posts by one of the big tech companies where they had these rules for online meetings, and the first rule was go to a quiet place in the house. Like, dude, that's so classist, man. It's just like really. So I responded on Twitter, and I'm like, this is not only tone deaf, this is classism at its best. 70 to 75% of my former students, there's no quiet place to go in the house.
Right.
Period. And even adding to that, which I alluded to this in my blog posting, how many kids are working to support their families and their household, and they're working now because they're in an quote unquote essential job.
And Ken,
it's ridiculous.
And Ken, it goes even deeper because, again, as you're talking about, I'm thinking about families of mine who live in hotels who, again, everybody's in the same room. But let's think about this situation too. You touched on students who are working to help support families. Here is my concern, and this is where I feel that the early opening of states is completely irresponsible, because you have issues where parents will now have to, in some cases, choose going to work, but daycares are closed and schools are closed. So who does that leave taking care of the kids? Well, it could be family, or it's going to most likely be siblings. And now are we going to have situations where we're talking some Depression era type stuff where teenage kids are not able to, even though there's compulsory education laws, cannot attend school because they are taking care of families. Here's the other thing we're going to have, and this is what I'm preparing my school district for. I oversee our digital virtual learning program. I said, I'm going to need expanded resources because I can guarantee you, even if we come up with the best reentry plan that makes everybody feel safe, I'm not going to say safe, but makes them feel safe, I guarantee you have families who are going to say, that's great, I don't want it. I want full-time virtual for my students the entire year. That's
exactly.
It. End of story.
Here's the thing. Do you blame them?
No.
I mean, they have access to healthcare. You already brought up one other thing. I'm going to add another layer to this because I think this needs to be inserted, and I'm purposeful in inserting it into our narratives. What about our rural school districts? What about the rural students? They don't even have access. Like think about it. There are some areas that I either have friends that work in or friends that live in, or that I've had the opportunity to go to, where even my cell phone, the connection is minimal at best. So that hotspot not even going to work.
Or worse. How about this? Let's add I'll go another layer on top of your layer. In those rural communities, because I lived in a rural community where I lived out on an unincorporated area, right?
Yeah.
First of all, getting internet access was hysterically funny because it was literally a guy standing on my roof pointing a satellite dish, in a direction. But the second thing I found out very quickly is people said, well, just go to your library. Couldn't you just go to your library? Library was only open 3 days a week. And because I was in an unincorporated area, I could not be a member of that library, even though I had no other services.
Wow, see, and that's just a cop out. Just go to your library. Just go. I remember early on at my last school, with a lot of the kids that didn't have internet access at home, one of the teachers took the time, or let me directly quote what she said. I took some of my valuable time to put together a document that has a list of all the places near the school where you have free internet access. And it was a library, which I'm a staunch advocate for public libraries anyway, but the library was on there, but you had Starbucks, you had McDonald's, you had all those others. And I couldn't sit still, and I couldn't sit in that faculty meeting and accept that. And of course I raised my hand, which, let's just say every time I raised my hand in a faculty meeting, the eyes would roll and everything else because, here it is, Ken, gonna say something. And I think in all honesty, I think those reactions were most so because of who the messenger was, not what my message was,
Hmm.
which goes back to my mention about anti-bias and anti-racist professional learning support. Now, with that being said, I just said, okay, so basically what you're saying is for some of our students, because the school is a Title I school, but you, in one classroom, you could have one student where the household income of their family is over $1 million sitting next to a student where it's only 30,000.
Hmm.
It was very, very much a significant delta of household income at that school. But I said, okay, so let me get this straight. Some of our students can go to the comforts of their own home, kick their feet up, connect to their work online, or do whatever they're going to do on their computer that their parents bought them, because we're not supplying them with this stuff,
Hmm.
the equipment. And maybe if they're really fortunate, which some of them are, they'll go home. Actually, they'll leave school. They'll do their extracurricular activity, whether it's dance or a sport or something along those lines. Then they'll go home. They'll go on their computer. They'll do a little bit of work. The food is already prepared for them, and then a tutor will come over and help them from, let's say, 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. or maybe 8 p.m. to 9 p.m.
Hmm.
So you have that one, but then you're saying that you want other students who might have to take care of a younger sibling, might have to do something that is required of them in the house. But what you're saying is, if you have a device, you can't go home. You have to go to any one of those places to do the same work that one of your classmates is able to do in comfort of their own home. And I said, that's unacceptable to me, and I will not do that. And that goes into a whole nother thing I'll be writing on probably between now and the end of this month, is the whole idea around homework. Because if people think that what we're currently looking at is inequitable, guess what? Homework has been that way even all the way back to when I was in school and you were in school.
Oh my God,
It's always the exact same thing.
we were so quick when we did our shutdown. Guess what? There were a lot of school districts who said we're going to use this as enrichment time. Okay, so let me get this straight.
Exactly.
Okay, you every day send home kids with expectations to complete homework. Yet
Right.
when we have a shutdown and they can't be in the school, you're going to make that, and you're going to make all that stuff that they do now at home enrichment. So I'm confused as to what then the value or the equity of homework is in and of itself. And who's the gentleman who writes quite a bit about the fallacy of the importance of homework?
Own.
Alfie Cohn, thank you. Yes, Alfie
Oh,
does
yeah.
some amazing work
And
on
all
that
stuff.
subject. Yeah,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
Ken, we've spent a lot of time. We've pointed out. I think between the two of us, I think we've hit on the large, I guess, problems of inequity. But let's pause for a second again, because there may be some people who are just inundated with a lot of things. Let's take it back one little bit. Equity, equality. What's the difference?
Okay, so equality is everyone gets the same thing,
Okay.
which I say that can be just as problematic. Treating everyone the same can be just as bad as treating them differently. So equality, everyone is the same. Equity is assessing where resources need to be allocated and then doing a distribution so that every student in this case has access and opportunity. So that's how I define equity: access and opportunity. So you do not treat everyone the same. You treat everyone differently, but that those differences are based on pragmatic information that you've been able to obtain, as well as an assessment of what those individualized needs are. And then the distribution and allocation of resources are appropriate based on the needs of the student so that they have access and opportunity. You cannot have an equitable classroom, school, organization, or anything if your default is, we'll just give everyone the same. So going back to our example, just give everyone a Chromebook. That's equality. Equity is, okay, if we're going to give everyone a Chromebook, we need to assess which students have access, which students don't. Now that we need to guarantee they have access. Now we need to assess what kind of access do they have. Now we need to assess when they do have access with their device and their hotspot, if you will, in the home, do they have a space that allows them access and opportunity to complete any of the work that might be assigned online? You see, the two are not only are they not even close to being the same. It is really important to be able to discern the difference and understand the difference between the two, so that when decisions are made, whether it's in the classroom, in a school district, or anything like that, is that it is you are ensuring access and opportunity for all students. And I'll even add that, and I do want to touch on the esports
We'll get there.
story that you told. Good, because ultimately, here's the thing. What we're currently dealing with right now is, and I know there's a list of words. There's social distancing. There's unprecedented. There's unexpected. There's all these things. Look, the bottom line is this. A lot of the things that we're dealing with now, they've always been there.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not the only voice that talks about these things, and I haven't been the only voice. I won't be the only voice, and I shouldn't be the only voice. You and I have actually talked about this quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
What's going on right now has just peeled back the veil of the inequities that have existed on a systemic level.
Yes.
And so for me, it's when we resume, what's going to be different, and more specifically, how courageous are educators across the entire educational spectrum, from superintendents all the way across the spectrum to classroom teaching assistants, which, by the way, they're just as important. And in fact, here's one. I always wonder, the more disconnected you are from students, the more influence you have on what happens to students. See that?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But I will say this. I have to add this. I'm friends with a lot of superintendents who they are the example of what I call exemplary leadership, because they make it a point. In fact, several of them, and I tease them about it because I'll text them, periodically, and I'm like, so how many classrooms did you get to this week? Because they make it a point to go to the schools that are in their districts and go into the classroom, and they're not going to classroom to, assess whether the teacher is doing well or not. They're just like, it helps keep me grounded on some of the decisions I make if I know exactly what's going on.
I can't agree more with that, Ken. In my role as the director of digital virtual learning, the biggest impact on me on a daily basis is the phone calls and Google Meets I do with students and sometimes their parents. And it's not, it is to check in. It is to say, like, hey, here's where you're at in your courses. I serve as the mentor. But what I also find out for them, for example, I had a wonderful conversation with a young lady yesterday, and I noticed that she wasn't working on one of her courses. We talked a little bit about it, but then we got into, well, especially in this time right now where those interpersonal connections are so important, having conversations with that student to find out what she does in her spare time. She's really into acrylics, like painting. I said, nice. Do you have enough supplies? She goes, well, I really wish I could get into like watercolors, but you can't buy any right now. Everywhere is sold out. Finding out things like that informs me as far as my virtual program. That my mission is to make virtual personal. How do I make a very impersonal thing like virtual learning a personal thing? And it starts with those conversations, those phone calls, with everything else other than the curriculum.
Correct. And so, again, going forward, which I will write about this, it's
and we're going to link to all of Ken's. I'm going to link to all your stuff, so we got to make sure you do.
I appreciate it. I mean, I'm having a new website built literally as we speak, because I want to change to a more responsive platform. But what I published last week is part of what I'm going to call an ongoing series called Real Talk About Education, which you and I have had lots of conversations that I would identify as quote unquote real talk, because it's going to go into a lot of what we're talking about here and now and going forward, as far as what is school going to look like? What should it look like? Who's being asked? I'm looking at some of the things posted now where people are going to billionaires and asking them, how can we reimagine education? Like, no, that's just a replication of the reason why we're in this situation now, is you're asking the wrong people. Ask the practitioners. You don't, look, I'll put it to you this way. You don't go to an executive chef and say, how can we make nursing better? You just don't. It's ridiculous. But again, this is one where, as educators, we have to amplify our collective voices and push back on that garbage and say, look, you know what? Just because someone went to school doesn't mean they know how to do school.
Well, Ken, I also have to tell you this. This is the one that always gets me. It is because a lot of families have this, and I know you and I both do as well too, because you led with this story. Well, I have my mother was a teacher or my father was a teacher, and I really respect teachers. Great, wonderful. Why are you talking policy to me? What? It's like my father worked on the Apollo space program. My father's worked in the airline industry for a number of years. I have a great working relationship with my father. Don't come to me about how to run an airline. Don't,
Right.
you know, if I said, oh, I'm going to start my own airline today, I am the worst person to have running an airline.
Right. No, it's going to have to change, and you even touched on it earlier as far as which will be another writing I will do.
I hope you're
You
writing
know,
all this down. I hope you have this all noted out too, like
no, I
up
have,
top.
trust me, I have a list. I have
Yeah.
a list, and I remember seeing a quote that kind of prompted me with this is if it doesn't challenge you, it won't change you.
Mhm.
And, and my whole thing is for educators, once we have some distance between what we're navigating right now and what you're doing later,
Mhm.
I'm going to ask questions like all of those PDs that were mandated by the school district, all of those conferences of which you got to choose the sessions you went to, all of those mechanisms that you could be the agency of your own learning. How well did they serve you right now? And more specifically, the question you should be asking yourself is, when I go to this session and learn about blank, how is it going to make me a better educator? And more specifically, how is it going to ensure access and opportunity for my students? A tool-based session is highly unlikely to do that unless you have assessed what areas of need your students have that are not being filled, and maybe that session on that tool can help you do that. But it does require a degree of introspective thought, reflection, assessment, and then, of course, me identifying the needs of students and then being responsive to those needs. But just simply going to 100 apps in 60 minutes is not going to cut it. In fact, not only is it not going to cut it,
Hey, stop for a second. You and I were at a conference early March, before all this broke. People were standing in line next to your session.
yes, yeah.
Why were they standing in line? Did they even know what they were standing in line for?
No, I remember that. It was a session on Google Classroom.
But
Yeah,
the people didn't say it was Google Classroom. They just said this is the Google session. Do you know what it's about?
right,
No. I mean,
correct.
it's statements like that that just make me like cringe. Like, well, then what?
Same here. Look, it's not so much a knock on Google. I
No.
will say that I'm a big fan of Google Apps for Education. Look at what it has done for students in schools that have Google Apps read. But to your point, yes, I had. So it was
And I didn't mean to do
my
that to put you on
sessions.
the spot, by the way. And
No, it's
again,
okay. It's
yeah,
okay.
it's not a
You
slam
know
on
what?
Google.
No, because here's the thing. The bottom line is we have to talk about this stuff because if you don't bring it up, you don't talk about it, then it's going to continue to persist and endure.
Hmm.
And so the thing is it's not so much a knock on all of the folks that were in line for that session because I did only talk to a few, a small handful. I'd say probably 10.
Hmm.
Okay, so I was in a ballroom that I was doing my session titled Designing a Culturally Relevant and Culturally Responsive Pedagogy. I would say there were probably about 200 people in my room, and the room could probably seat honestly, probably about 400 to 500.
Hmm.
There were at least 400 people in line for that session. And yes, I asked the question because I was like, wow, there's a long line for this session too. And I literally said, hey, what's the session? They're like, well, it's some Google thing. And I'm like, what Google thing? Well, Google Classroom. I'm like, okay, what are you going to learn about? Who's the presenter? Who cares? It's Google.
Yeah,
That,
that's
that,
it.
that right there is like, I didn't have enough time to engage in a constructive conversation with those folks because I would have said, okay, so have you assessed that Google Classroom is going to transform the opportunity and access that your students have, and that's why you're choosing that session? Or is it because it's safe and comfortable and you don't want to push your thinking, and more specifically, you're not cognizant of the fact that every time you choose a session for learning that doesn't make you better, the collateral damage are all the students that don't have access and opportunity.
And to bring this around to esports, because again, there has been a tremendous rush to implementation. There have been some of the best meaning people who have made grand overtures, lots of followers. The Twitterverse is full of what some of us will refer to as charlatans in a lot of ways, educational charlatans. Some good people, but there are some who are they just speak because they have a pulpit.
Right.
But what I find is that this rushed implementation is people who see the surface and they don't think beyond the games. They don't think beyond the computers. They just think, oh, I'm just going to have my esports team. Well, there's a lot more to an esports team, again, than computers and PCs and games, because if you stop there, you're missing out on the much bigger opportunity that you have to really connect with kids, right, to bring in this entire ecosystem that's beautiful. But what's now going to be even more, I think, as people start to unpack esports in the age of COVID, these issues that we've already touched on, access, the kids who need this the most. And you said, I think you said it just a little bit ago, about how if it doesn't change you or challenge you, it doesn't change you, right? Some of the biggest conversations those of us who are involved with esports right now are going to have to have with finance departments, with other educational leaders. When we say, that Chromebook's really nice for my esports team, I want a full-on PC and I want something that's probably triple or quadruple the price. But because I know that this is something that for kids, when they engage in it, is meaningful. It's a pathway to college for some of them. For some of them, it's the only way that they do engage. As you said, equity. We have to think in an equitable way. The Chromebook, I'm a fan of Chromebooks. I like them, but they serve one dirty task, and it's all got to be.
That's right. A purpose. That's the key. A purpose, not the purpose.
Right.
I do want to add to what you're saying, that I think will help with the perspective on esports. So you can't field a football team if they don't have the right equipment.
Right.
And space. What is the purpose of having a football team on a high school campus? And I'm not asking you, because you and I have talked about this, but ultimately for your listeners, why do you have a sports program? Mm-hmm. And I will share the answer I get from a lot of school leaders, and that ultimately is sports enhance student experiences on campus. They give mm-hmm. students access and opportunity to do extracurricular activities. I will say that when I was in high school, my high school was certainly one of the best in regards to what you could do. I mean, I played 4 sports in high school.
Where did you go to high school?
Culver City High School.
Okay.
So here in Southern California. So you had a robust athletic program. I mean, we even had a diving team, because I remember there were some folks that were working on trying to qualify for the Olympic trials.
Were you a diver?
I've dived before, but I am not a diver.
Okay.
But you know what though? But honestly, real talk.
Yeah.
Several of my friends were on the swim team, and I would go and I'd be like, I want to go jump off the high dive and stuff. And then of course I'd challenge them in the pool, and maybe I should have been a swimmer instead of a football player. I'd have less aches and pains. But
sure.
With that being said, though, which that would have been another way to break down some of the stereotypical misperceptions that people have, especially about African American men in the pool. But sure. With that being said, well, you know what? A very good friend of mine was a classmate of mine in college, and he just missed qualifying for the Olympics twice, in 1992 and in 1996. But at any rate, my main point though is that they enhance access and opportunity for students on campus. Mm-hmm. That's the same thing with esports. And what I've encouraged school leaders to look at is, when you're going to implement and start and implement an esports program, you want to approach it not unlike you do the other sports programs. One, it's an investment, not an expenditure. And that mm-hmm. investment is for the access and opportunity for students to have a sense of belonging on campus, have all of the things that I know I benefited from with being on a team, having mm-hmm. a purpose, having something you can look forward to that ideally is including the curriculum and that. But some cases, let's be real, some cases it's despite the curriculum and the learning environments that they're in. Mm-hmm. And I would say that, I would challenge any school leader. If you are pushing for a college going culture on your campus and you do not have an esports team, then I've got to question that, because ultimately there are opportunities for kids to be able to participate on esports teams and earn scholarships to a college or university. So just like I was fortunate enough to be able to do that playing football, any student should have the access and opportunity to do it within an area that they have a good enough skill set in, but more specifically, they have an interest in, and that interest, or the catalyst for that interest, is a sense of belonging and a purpose. I just have to add, and then because I know you want to ask me another question, and in
Yes.
fact, you're one of the stories where I hear about students who are othered. It's the best
Hmm.
way I can describe it. And for your audience, one, if you don't know what othered means, it means you haven't been the victim of it. And ultimately, othered is some component of their identity, whether it's their gender identity, their racial identity, their socioeconomic status identity, their language identity, some component of their identity has been treated as less than. That means they've been othered. I'm seeing more and more and more and more now where many schools are not only starting, but creating robust esports teams. And the composition of those teams generally are students who have been othered,
Yes.
which means you are now decreasing the likelihood that they will drop out of school, decreasing the likelihood that their sense of not being seen and heard on campus can compromise their academic performance, increasing access and opportunity to options when they graduate,
Hmm.
increasing a sense of camaraderie. And I've seen it with some schools where the esports teams, they get jerseys. So here's the thing.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and I love it, because
You can
here's the
see it
thing.
behind me. I have if you're watching the
Yeah,
video,
perfect. Yes,
there's
because here's the thing. In high school, every Friday, the football team would wear their jerseys on campus.
right.
Okay, in the fall. On
Hmm.
Thursdays, when I was on the freshman team, we'd wear our jerseys on campus. So you know who's on what teams.
Hmm.
And there would be other ways. Like I remember our women's basketball team. They were pretty amazing. Periodically, they would wear their jerseys, during the basketball season and stuff like that, or they would wear, the tops of their sweats. But my
Right.
whole point is they would wear the apparel that's associated with the team they were on and wear it on campus as a source of pride
Hmm.
and to encourage additional support from their classmates. I'm
Yes.
seeing that with esports teams now too, and it needs to happen. It just needs to happen. It needs
Ken,
to happen, and it needs to happen because the kids deserve better. They deserve better than what they're getting.
I'll tell you this too. In our school district in Racine, and this was something I got initial pushback on, or disbelief or side eye looks, when one of our issues of access, of course, is that we didn't have equal technology, right, in the schools. And so we partnered with a gaming lounge in town that allowed us to rent space like you rent a bowling alley.
Yeah.
And what we did do was I put all 5 high school teams together in the same space. Now we're talking about a city of Racine that is high poverty. There's gang problems. It's very divided racially. It got rated one of the most negative, I guess you could say, cities for African Americans in the United States. But what we did was, by putting all 5 high schools together, what did we do? We increased that community. You don't see that with football. You don't see that with basketball. You don't see that with traditional sports. As you're saying, or I shouldn't say, it wasn't just me, it was the work of a lot of people. But we took these othered kids from across the city who may have only been sectioned off because of their address, and now they know each other across town. When COVID broke, we have our Discord server, and I saw kids from other schools checking in on other kids. When we couldn't get buses, what did kids do? They would drive across town to go to the gaming lounge, and we would pick up kids along the way who needed it. Didn't matter what school you're at. If you needed a ride, we worked out a ride for you. But let me ask you this. And this is, I think this is important to point out too, is that you talk about this next step, going to college. You went to Culver City High School. You played football at UCLA. So you had that football connection. Were you going to, and I'm guessing that your father was an educator, that you were going to go to college regardless, but was UCLA going to be, if you weren't going to play football, was UCLA going to be your choice?
So first of all, I do come from a family of educators.
Yes.
One of the things I do share in the workshops that I do around organizational culture is that I'm not first generation in my family to go to college. I'm not second. I'm not third. At a minimum, I'm fourth, minimum. So I do come from a family of very well-educated folks.
Sure.
And keep in mind, this goes all the way back to at least fourth generation, where if you were Black growing up here in the United States, it was a high likelihood you would not go to college. And so basically going to college was never a question mark for me, ever.
But I think what I'm trying to get at is, again, looking at it through the lens of some of my own kids who now have esports. And as we talked about the scholarship opportunities, they are now considering schools that they never considered before. So I guess even though you lived in Culver City and UCLA was basically right there, was UCLA, if you weren't playing football, was it going to be your first choice, or were you considering other options?
I had other options. So, my other options at the time were Georgia Tech, University of Arizona, and then I had already gotten my congressional nomination for the United States Air Force Academy as well, because I come from a military family as well. So, I did have other options.
Well, and let me ask you this then, because for me, and again, this goes back to the value of these extracurriculars on campus. I went to Purdue University. Unfortunately, we never got to play UCLA in a Rose Bowl, but that will happen one day, I'm sure, somewhere in the future where we will get to sit down and have that. But for me, I got to Purdue fine. Going to college was never an issue. My father went to the University of Notre Dame. My mother went to the College of Notre Dame, ironically, in Belmont, California. But the marching band, while there was no school of music at Purdue University, the marching band with 400 kids was the thing that kept me in the university. It was that social fabric that kept me there. Yeah. It's the thing when I showed up on campus, I had 400 people to hang out with. We got to commiserate awful football because my first year was 1993 and Purdue went 1-11 in the Big Ten that year. It was a terrible team, terrible season, but we sat there and froze our butts off on Saturdays in November and October. That was the thing that kept me in. Was there ever a doubt with you that football kept you at UCLA?
Oh, that's a good question. No, because I love school, man.
You're a nerd.
No, it's not so much that, honestly.
And that's a good thing.
It is. I think it's a virtue, but look, football was one part of my school experience. It was the driver for my school experience, but keep in mind when I graduated from high school, and it's funny because at my recent high school reunion, two of my high school classmates who organized a reunion, they kind of teased me because they had gone back and looked at our yearbook and were looking at who participated in various, clubs and groups and things like that. And the two of them, they looked at me and they laughed and they were like, we just went through and looked at, our senior year and all the clubs everyone was in. They were like, was there a club you weren't in? And so for me, it was like, my whole thing was maximizing the experiences I could have on campus. So, and my dad, part of it was my dad understanding the school game. Yes, let's be real. If you're going to apply to a college, the more extracurricular activities you have and the longer you commit to them, it does look better.
Sure. But
with that being said, for me, I was in academic decathlon, student government, student council. I was in the Spanish club. I was in the French club. I was in the honor society. I was in the, there were several others. There was one, I can't remember the name of it, was the community service club. Like all those things where I was like, okay, I want to get more experiences. And what it did, believe it or not, is it was a good way of looking at developing what I would say groups of friends that weren't solely reliant upon who my teammates were on my sports teams. And so even at when I was at UCLA, I had friends that didn't play sports. I had friends that played other sports. I remember one of my teammates, he was a receiver, Sean LaChapelle. He and I used to always go in the spring to the baseball games because a couple of our teammates did play on the baseball team there. And yes, we played football together, but for he and I, it was just like, we're going to go cheer on our classmates, our teammates who play baseball. And we did have a pretty good baseball team. In fact, UCLA's had a very good baseball program.
Yeah.
So for me, it was like that. And then I remember my sophomore year, I started taking classes in it was on the North Campus is what the area that it's called. I had screenwriting classes. I took theater classes. I wasn't a theater major because you can't be a theater major and play sports. You just can't do that. And this was after I had shifted my original major, which was biology, because ultimately I think the demarcation to determine if you're going to pursue that or not is organic chemistry, which I'll remember was Chem 11A.
I was a chemistry major.
Okay. So, but my main point to share out with you is that, yeah, football was a big part of it. I love sports. Like I said, I played quite a few sports in high school. But ultimately for me, it was basically like one chapter of my whole book of college. And that's why even now, and even when I was in a classroom, I encourage my students that, when you go to college, don't just go to class. Find a group, obviously the easy ones are the fraternities and sororities, but I'm like, but you don't even have to do that. I know that by the time I graduated, there was a whole group, and I remember going to a couple of their, if you will, performances. There was a whole group of Black students, Latinx students, Asian American students that were representatives from the various clubs, if you will, on campus. They started organizing. It was always in spring quarter, and I want to say it was every other week. They would do in like the coffee house on campus, they would do a spoken word night, which was amazing because it was cool. It's like, okay, here's another thing that you can participate in. You don't have to, but it's open for you to do it. And again, the beauty of UCLA, which I'm unapologetic about this. When I was there, it's different now, fortunately. The diversity of campus, and I'm like, that's why I shared. It was those representations from various groups, and those were the big ones. You do a spoken word event every 2 weeks, free, and you just go there and you listen and cheer them on, and man, it was just cool. And so I think, so ultimately, a really roundabout way of answering your question, football was definitely the driver for a lot of what I've done and what I did, but it was not the only thing that I did.
And I think it's important, and we're going to have to wrap up now, unfortunately. But I think it's important to juxtapose what you just said. Again, let's bring this back to equality. Let's bring this back to issues of access. And now the internet is now, in a lot of ways, access to the internet is a social justice issue. It should be a utility. Think of the kid who, as we were talking about those that are othered, who esports has been their only activity that they have done outside of school, outside of the compulsory being there from whatever time in the morning to whatever time in the afternoon. This is their social fabric. This has become and I see, it makes me mad. It makes me sad to see kids lose this opportunity when, again, it's not like football or baseball, which are canceled for everybody. I see the news stories that say esports is thriving. And I always have to ask the question, for whom?
For who? Exactly.
Who is esports thriving for? Because it's not for some of my kids. It's thriving for professionals. And so what we need is there needs to be almost like, as we're getting into this, again, this COVID age of school, this 2020-21 school year, which is going to be the age of COVID, we need to rethink esports in bold ways. We need to think about it in ways of access. Again, wrapping it all together. And again, you look at the demographics, 97% of boys and 83% of girls across socioeconomics, across race, play video games. Let's give them that social fabric. Let's give them something that they can do outside of sitting at home, potentially in front of a computer and just focusing on curriculum. And let's try to socially bind them together the best way we can. It's still triage. Nothing's perfect. But we want to try the best that we possibly can right now to give kids the best opportunity.
I full agreement, and I have a request, and I'm putting you on a spot, and your listeners will hear this unless you edit this out.
I won't.
I want to come back. And I want you and I to do an episode on the intersectionality between esports and other areas of the curriculum.
We can do that,
especially some of the platforms that I know esports teams compete on.
Mm-hmm.
There are social dynamics that the esports or that the video game platform can be, and is in some cases, a metaphorical representation of real life. I want us to talk about that because
Absolutely.
that will help bolster the argument around esports that it shouldn't be looked at as another expense, another thing that's over there. What it should be looked at as, again, enhancing access and opportunity for the students' experience on campus. And, I mean, like I can even think historically in social studies or even in English, how you can incorporate some of the different gaming platforms that teams compete on within those particular content areas.
Oh, sure.
So then I want to hear it about why we shouldn't have an esports team or why we can't or any of those sorts of things. Look, the bottom line is if you look at it as an investment, not an expenditure, that eliminates an awful lot of barriers to the grossly irresponsible narratives that tend to be given more agency than they should be around meeting the needs of our students, ensuring equity, and ensuring that their experiences are aligned with a sense of belonging, a sense of importance, and a sense of purpose, and not just you have to go to school because, well, you have to.
Ken, where can people connect with you and where can they read I know you're redeveloping your website, and I'll link to the blog post that you did just this last week, but where can people connect with you otherwise?
Yeah, so when the new site launches, it will be seamless, so it won't matter as far as being able to connect to it. My website is kennethshelton.net. And then on that website, it has links to my various social media things, which I use Twitter quite heavily. I use Instagram quite heavily. One of the things that I have also done is looked at launching several YouTube channel series that I'm going to be doing. The sad part is that they're better if I can do them in person. But at any rate, the website, I have also looked at making a shift on the content that I know I have or that I want to do and producing it and putting it out there and not worrying about being judged for it, because ultimately those that consume it will find value in it, and those that don't, guess what? You don't have to consume it. But I want to do more in contributing to the educational space within my, the scope of my perspective, my experience, my expertise.
And if you're not challenged, you're not changing, right?
If you're not challenged, you're not changing.
Ken Shelton, thank you so much for being on the Academy of Esports podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
That will do it for this week on the Academy of Esports. I've been your host, James O'Hagan. Esports are organized competitive video games allowing schools to redefine their athletic culture, diversify opportunities for student participation, promote good physical and mental health, increase collegiate scholarship pathways, and play games. We can never forget the importance of play. The mission of the Academy of Esports is to support these ideals. The vision of the Academy of Esports is for all students to experience the fun and joy of playing competitive video games. You may follow me on Twitter at Jim O'Hagan. That's at JIMOHAGAN, and through the Academy of Esports account at TAO Esports. It's a great way to get the latest blog posts, podcast episodes, and news coming out of esports and education. And remember, you can continue your engagement by going to www.taoesports.com. You can also connect through Facebook at www.facebook.com/TAOesports. Thanks again for listening, and I look forward to our time again next week.